This is Trial Transcripts Exposed by Crime in Court with Heather. Raw courtroom reads with my commentary. Let's dive in. Hi everyone, welcome back to Crime in Court with Heather. This is Trial Transcripts Exposed, reading through the Menendez brothers' second trial. This is the defense's case, part 77. And that is going to be out of 92, so we are getting closer to the end of the defense's case. We will then have some rebuttal, then we'll have our closing arguments, and then we're going to have the penalty phase. So just to let you know, there is also the penalty phase we're going to go over, which is another few weeks of trial. So just to be prepared. So anywho, let us begin with thanking my Justice Insiders and my founding Justice Insiders. So thank you to Toyota Girl 67, SLB 29488, May the Force be with you 4313, Jessica Weenan 6079, Mrs. Apples 2007, Butler 89833, Brooke JF, Jen P 773, Boom Chicka Wow Wow 1, Kendall B 5757, Carly 0406. Then we have Ashley 83, True Crime Debates, Sandy South 5706, Chickenhead 33, Nicoti O Nirotini. That one I struggle with, so I don't know if I'm saying that right. That's So Nelly, spelled like a sewing machine. Julie E 6770, 1-800-Fraudbusters, Bezo Jones, and Hannah Banana Bandana 23. Thank you all for being founding Justice Insiders, which means you became a Justice Insider early on, first and foremost, before anybody else. But that does not mean that we are not also not grateful for Justice Insiders, Laney Jane 91, Couch Potato Pro, and Tech Vibe _42. You guys are also very appreciated. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for all of you just for watching. And if you would like your screen name read at the beginning of every video, just like I'm doing for the Justice Insiders, you can become a Justice Insider by going to my membership perks, and you will have your name read, or your handle name read in every episode. All right, so thank you guys again for your memberships, and thank you to those, even if you are not a member, just for watching. So let's get started. We left off with where did we leave off? Let me go back and look. So in 76, we had arguments outside of the jury for like about 2 hours. And then we finally had Dr. John Wilson, who is a psychologist and evaluated Erik Menendez. He comes to the stand and continues his direct. If you remember, his direct was carried over from days prior on the stand when he had to go back to teaching. And then now he's back on the stand. So that's where we left off. And we went to lunch on Friday, January 19th, 1996. We're going to continue where they come back from their lunch break. I should probably shrink myself here first. All right. So the court, we're back on the record now. He says, all right, let's have the jury out, please. The jury enters the courtroom. The court says the jury is back in the box. You may continue your direct examination. Ms. Abramson for Erik's team says, thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Wilson, we've been talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, and ordinarily when you come to evaluate a patient, whether it's for research, for you're treating him, or in a forensic setting, is that person removed from the traumatic causing environment? Yes. Is there a distinction when you're evaluating Erik Menendez as he was on August 20th, 1989? You have indicated that you have diagnosed him as suffering from PTSD on that date. That's correct. And he was at that time removed from the trauma, including any trauma creating situation? No, he was not. How would you describe the environment from a trauma standpoint in which he was living at that time? The witness answers, Mr. Erik Menendez continued to live with his family of origin, in which throughout his childhood years and up to that date had been in a traumatic environment. So he continued to live and to function within a family in which there had been repeated traumatic acts on a continuous basis up to and including that day. It's a really good explanation of, to summarize very, briefly of what they went through. This is a really good explanation to sum up how traumatizing it would have been in that house. It was ongoing, it was continuous, it was over and over again, repeated. So I think that answer really highlights that. Ms. Abramson says, and what, in your opinion, would be the effect if you compare him to someone who, let me strike that, nevertheless, you're saying he also suffered from PTSD at that time? That's correct. From the previous traumas? Correct. So all those other traumas he had when starting from, 5 years old until, current day, those are all still in his mind and within part of his psyche as he evaluates the situation on August 20th, which I've been saying and screaming during all of these conversations between the state and the defense, arguing in front of the judge saying that this abuse shouldn't come in. According to the state, they say all this abuse evidence shouldn't come in, when in reality it all compounds to the person and the relationship that you have formed with that person, and the perspective in which you view that person from when you were 5 all the way until 20 or 18, whatever it might be. Your perspective on that person is affected by, greatly impacted by, all of those traumatic events that took place previously. So hopefully they get into how that is important, why we need to talk about those previous traumas. So he said that that's correct. She says from the previous traumas, correct. So all those previous traumas, like I said, they're still affecting his psyche. But was re-experiencing traumatization close in time to that day? Yes. What would be the difference in from the standpoint of a person's moment to moment, day to day anxiety level or hypervigilance activity of someone who is still living in the trauma inducing environment? Their anxiety or hypervigilance would be more pronounced because the potential for the threat, the potential for the harm, the potential for the traumatic event remains high as they're in the context of that environment rather than being out of that environment in which the trauma is taking place. So the stress, the anxiety, all of it remains at a high. It might wane and, wax and wane in its intensity, but it's always underlying the situation. Let me make sure my highlighter is on because it's not. Okay. Next question from Ms. Abramson. She says, when we have been talking all along about people with post-traumatic stress disorder and how they can react to cues, did you have in mind people who have nevertheless left the trauma environment? Yes. Could you give us a hypothetical comparison between someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder and is in the environment versus someone who has it and is not in that environment anymore, who's left, who's removed themselves from that environment? He says, sure. A hypothetical example of someone who has left the traumatic environment might be in the case of someone who is in a very serious automobile accident in which they are injured and there is a potential of death. Or similarly, it might be like the disaster of an airplane crash in which there are people who are injured and killed in the crash, but there are also survivors. or it could also be a one-time event, such as a natural disaster. It could be an earthquake or a flood or something of that nature, just some kind of fluke emergency, something or other, or accident. These are single events, single traumas. They have a starting point and they have an end point. So the person who survives that trauma and who develops post traumatic stress disorder may, in fact, have not only all the symptoms of, that was my dog, sorry, not only the symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder, but react to cues later on as well, as they could cause him to be hypervigilant. But it's a one time event. So break it down so far. So you can still have PTSD develop when you have a one-time, one-off event, but you're going to leave that situation. You're not going to remain in that place forever. You're not on the plane forever that crashes, right? So you're going to be rescued, you're going to move, continue on with your life and doing your daily things, but anytime you see a plane, hear a plane, you might experience PTSD. Now, the difference between multiple events, says the witness, especially one that's repetitive, ongoing, reoccurring, is that it may be very difficult for the person to terminate the threat. A couple of hypothetical examples include, for example, torture victims who are the victim of physical torture under political oppression. Typically, these are people who are in a controlled environment. They don't have a way to get out, they don't have a way to escape, and the torture is ongoing. And there is very little that they can do to stop it because they're in this contained and controlled environment in which they're tortured. So think of it like, those people who, prisoners of war or whatever, that are stuck in a little tiny cement block or cell or whatever, and they keep the lights on and they have music blaring in their ears so that they cannot have a moment of peace, because once you're sensitive, you can't sleep, you can't, you're not eating properly, they don't give you full, 3 meals a day, whatever, you're being tortured obviously, so they're not going to treat you all that well. So all of that is going to be anxiety inducing, stressful, obviously. In that situation, their anxiety and arousal tends to be a lot higher because the specter, the possibility, the probability that further injury or harm is about to happen remains very high. They can't leave, they're stuck. And they have no control over the situation. So that's going to give you more and more anxiety. Because if you think about it, anxiety is the fear of what's happening in the future that hasn't happened yet. And so that's a distinct difference. And also, hypothetically, you could have a different situation in a family where there is an ongoing abuse of one type or another. Now we're talking family abuse. Now we're talking Jose and Kitty. The one that comes to my mind right now is in cases where there is several physical abuse or severe physical abuse in a family to women and children by an alcoholic parent who acts in violent ways towards the family members. And as long as that alcoholic parent is there and acts violently in physically abusive ways, that threat remains to the people who are the victims of that kind of activity. So that physical threat, that parent, that person you can't, that's your parent, you can't escape your parent. It's similar to being in the torture cell, but disguised as freedom, right? So that's the distinction that we can make between a single event, a repetitive event, or multiple occurring events. Ms. Abramson asks, would it be fair to draw a parallel with the Vietnam soldier who, while he is in Vietnam, has been traumatized, has symptoms of PTSD, but it is also out in the jungle trying to deal day to day with the potential for additional trauma and injury versus the one who's been traumatized and is now back home in the States, out of the war, out of the dangerous situation? Sure, you can make the distinction. That's an excellent example. So let's say you have two Vietnam soldiers, both have suffered post traumatic stress disorder and are on, anxiety driven and on a, just like running on tension type of thing. Because when you have PTSD, you're usually, not always aware of what you're doing. Your fight or flight brain is what's in charge at that moment. So you've got two Vietnam soldiers. One goes home and goes back to his family. When he hears fireworks on the 4th of July, he has flashbacks. That's PTSD in someone who has left. But his normal everyday to day, he can still function sometimes and some around some things, but every now and then he might hear a noise or see something on the news that makes him think about his days in Vietnam, and then he's triggered to have PTSD symptoms again. Otherwise, he's going about his day and he's not necessarily thinking about his time in Vietnam. Now, go back to the other soldier, and that soldier's still in Vietnam. He's already been suffering PTSD. He's still in the jungles trying to act out his mission here in the army or whatever. And his tension is going to be at a super all-time high because he's still in the situation. He doesn't have that time to relax during his day-to-day moments. Like Soldier A, who went home to his family, he has his family time. He has other distractions that can keep his mind off of what happened in Vietnam. He can go work. He can go, spend time with his children and things of that nature. Whereas Vietnam guy is still in Vietnam. He can't leave. He can't escape. The jungle is still around him wherever he opens his eyes. So he can't escape those triggers that he's constantly being triggered, basically, is the point. So that was a really good example by Miss Abramson. I liked that. The next question she asks, now they're both going to have a lot of symptoms? Yes. In my hypothetical, is one of them going to be operating on a much higher level of day-to-day anxiety and stress? Sure, the one who is still in the war zone is going to be operating in a much higher level of anxiety or stress because he or she is still in the environment where the threat is, the potential for injury, harm, being killed, and so on, or having that happen to others is still very high. So the level of anxiety, tension, arousal, and fear are much more pronounced when he is still in that situation. Makes sense. Ms. Amerson says, now, one of the things that was mentioned in the symptom clusters, and I am always losing the page in the book, but the symptom clusters for post-traumatic stress disorder is a sense of helplessness? Yes. Now, what causes this feeling of helplessness that traumatized people seem to share as a symptom? What causes the symptom of helplessness in traumatized people is the belief they develop based on their experiences that no matter what they do, they can't stop what's happening to them. They can't terminate the threat. They can't terminate the trauma. That their own responsiveness, their own behaviors, their own thoughts, their own actions, their own decisions for that matter, can have little effect on the outcome that's occurring to them. That's why you become helpless. Because every time you've tried to help yourself or asked for help, you get denied. You're told horrible things by your parents to prevent you from trying to help yourself. Like, if you tell anyone, I'll kill them and you, things of that nature. He goes on to say, and in that regard, then, that's the essence of learned helplessness. They have a lack of perceived control to perceive the inversive consequences to them. So they can't see that they can get out of the situation and actually help themselves by taking action, taking steps, but they don't know that because they haven't learned that along the way. Now, is that always a rational perception on their part that there's nothing they could, in fact, do to avoid trauma? Or is that a perception that's dictated by the fact that they are traumatized people? Mr. Khan says, objection vague as to who is being referred to. The court says, sustained. Ms. Abramson says, all right. Is there a concept called learned helplessness? This keeps coming up. This is a big deal. So let's hear what this is. The witness says, yes. Does it apply to people who have PTSD? Yes. Does it also apply to people who do not necessarily have PTSD but have symptoms and effects of being in abusive or battering relationships? Yes. Where does the terminology learned helplessness come from in the literature? Sorry, my tongue slurred there for a second. He says the terminology learned helplessness comes from the experimental research of Dr. Marty Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania. And what was Dr. Seligman's research? What did that consist of? Dr. Seligman's research consisted of studying animal responses initially in an experimental paradigm in which they were exposed to aversive stimulation. More specifically, these were electric shock to a grid in which the animal, usually it was a rat in the early phases, but there were many species that were studied. So the animal is in this learning chamber, and the basic paradigm that the animal cannot escape from getting an electric shock no matter what they do. Whether they try to escape by going from one side of the cage to another, or whether there are other ways they might try to terminate what's happening. Eventually, when the shock is delivered on an unpredictable level, that animal stops responding altogether. And in the state of learned helplessness, animals in a laboratory setting, virtually the animal stops responding. They will lay on an electric grid and continue to receive electric shocks and make no attempt whatsoever to try to escape or do another kind of action or behavior that would be related to try to terminate it. Interesting. So, is it, if I understand the experiment, first in the beginning of this learning process for the animal, they do try to take evasive action or to avoid the shock? Yes. And after they learn that nothing they do can change the trauma from happening to them, they do nothing at all? They eventually just stop responding altogether. They don't die, they just stop fighting. Some do die. Oh. And following this observation of the behavior where they're just laying on the grid getting the electric shock, were their brains examined? Yes. Were the hormones that are associated with the high states of arousal detected in their brains? Yes. Objection, irrelevant, sustained, the answer stricken. Abramson says, is the understanding from the research that the animal, or for example, wasn't frightened or aroused or didn't want to avoid the shock? No. So that medical evidence supported the notion that the fear and the anxiety and the rest of it were being generated by the anticipation of the shock. Objection leaning, sustained. Ms. Abramson says, what did the research show with respect to arousal? The witness says, the research showed that when they autopsied the animals and examined their brains, that objection, irrelevant, and non-responsive. Sustained. The whole area is preliminary to something else, and why don't we just move on to what you want to get to? Ms. Abramson says, without performing autopsies later to verify it, has there been in the literature concerning battered women, abused children, and people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder a general acceptance in the psychological community that people suffer from learned helplessness also? Yes. Under what kind of environments do people develop this behavioral trait of learned helplessness? There were many different environments in which people can develop this trait of learned helplessness. It's an environment in which there is an ongoing threat, a repetitive threat. That's the key. It's an environment in which someone may have control over their behavior. Well, we know Jose and Kitty did just about everything for them, including doing their homework and things like that. They had no real autonomy or freedom or anything like that. She says, I don't understand who may have control. The witness says there may be another person. For example, we just talked about torture victims, okay? There may be a situation in which another human being has the capacity to control what happens in the environment so that the person begins to believe that there is very little they can do to terminate that, and that can lead to learned helplessness. Remember all the times that he thought Kitty was psychic or something because she knew what Erik was up to? Well, that's also part of that learned helplessness, is that like kind of not torturing them, but in a way like a constant reminder when, Kitty would say, "Well, you're not doing that." When it's like, "Well, how did she know that I was planning on doing that? She must have heard it over the phone or something, but they didn't know that at the time." So if, she would refer to something that she wasn't supposed to know, he would think she had these magical powers or whatever. He testified to that. But he doesn't really believe that in reality. But, in that environment, when you're growing up that way and your mom knows all your secrets, it's kind of hard not to think something's weird, right? But that's part of her control over him. Every time she would drop a little nugget like, "Oh, well, when you told Lyle so and so," or something, she's dropping that little hint like, "I'm in control of you. You don't have control over your environment. I control it. I control who you talk to. I control what you say and who, how it gets said, who I hear it or how I hear it, things like that." So, constant reminder that you are helpless in your environment and I'm the one in control. The witness goes on to say, "We also see it commonly in hostage situations where people are taken hostage and held hostage for ransom or other demands, that this relationship between the person who is doing the capturing and the hostage can very much, the victim can develop a state of learned helplessness as well. And certainly we see it in the literature on childhood abuse in various forms." Well, of course, in child abuse, it makes the most sense because you're not developing your own skills to become independent when your parents are doing your homework for you and planning your entire life and making all of your free time all about tennis and things like that. Abramson says, "Well, now, is learned helplessness simply a behavioral change, or is there a self image component to learned helplessness?" There is a self image component as well, he says. Can you explain that? The self image component in learned helplessness is that the person feels that there is not a great deal that they can do to affect the outcome of their life or specific situation. Frequently associated with learned helplessness are feelings of low self esteem, worthlessness, incompetence, a feeling of being out of control, that it doesn't matter what one does, that someone else has more power and more influence. It can also lead to states of demoralization where the person feels blue and depressed and rather helpless, that there is much that they can do about what's happening in their life. Now, Dr. Wilson, are there some common misconceptions about the behavior of people, including children and adults, who are living in abusive domestic situations? Yes. Well, people who have been repetitively abused physically, sexually, and psychologically? Yes. Is one of those common misperceptions that people who are subjected to negative treatment by others will leave? Yes. Why is that perception, or why is that a misperception? Sorry. Why is that a misperception? Why don't people who are mistreated just say no and leave? There are a lot of different reasons why people just don't say no and leave. They include such things as there may be a dependent relationship, for example, between parent and a child. Well, why aren't children who aren't being treated nicely just leave? Why why aren't children who aren't being treated nicely, why don't they just leave? Objection irrelevant. As phrased, it is irrelevant. Are you talking about children in general or children classified as having suffered from PTSD or what? Ms. Abramson says, "I think we are talking about what is the nature of dependency is what we are really talking about. I think you said people in dependent relationships." The court says, "Back up to the general area of discussion here." Ms. Abramson says, "Yes." The court says, "It's unclear as to what category of people it's talking about." Ms. Abramson says, "We are talking about those people who are in abusive relationships." He says, "Yes." People don't leave because the witness answers, they don't leave for a lot of different reasons. Okay. He goes on to say, okay, and one of them is that they're dependent on their parents, that the parents have the responsibility to nurture, meet their needs, provide shelter, comfort, clothing. And so there is a genuine dependency of the child on the parents at many levels. Secondly, there is an emotional bonding between the child and the parent, and that's a bonding that in most families, and including specifically abusive families, involves both experiences of love and affection and warmth between the parent and the child, but it may also include experiences of abuse, degradation, exploitation, and manipulation. So the child has the dual emotional relationship, love and hate, if you will, with the parents, so that there are both good and bad, positive and negative aspects to the relationship. A third factor is there is a psychological factor that the child may not see that they have any alternates. They may not recognize that there are things that they can do. They may simply not be aware that there are some alternatives they might be able to try to stop the abuse. Well, let's say we were talking about a young child, but not a, let's say we were talking about not a young child, but about a teenager. Could a teenager also have this psychological factor that they can't see that they have alternatives? Sure. How can that happen? It can happen in a number of ways. One is, of course, in the phenomena of learned helplessness with repetitive conditioning and learned growing up in an environment where there are threats about disclosure of the abuse or threats about what would happen if one were to report the kinds of abuse that's taking place could well keep the child in the fabric of that abusive environment. Number two is often a great feeling of shame and guilt that children have. And here we are talking about teenagers. The shame that somehow they're responsible for what's happened to them, the guilt over what they've done, the kind of behavior that they have engaged in an abusive relationship. And related to the shame and the guilt is often a sense of fear, of humiliation, or fear of retaliation if they were to tell what it was that's happened to them in the context of the family. And related to those dimensions as well is the great sense of embarrassment. This part is the same component, the shame component. I think that it's embarrassing to talk about these things. Often the teenage person aware that maybe their family is a little bit different than another family, and so to talk about these things would bring an embarrassment to the teenager and a potential embarrassment to the family. So it's not safe, not so it's safer not to do those things. Ms. Abramson asks, well, apart from talking about it, because that's another misconception that abused children would report it if it were happening. Yes. What we were talking specifically about is why they don't leave. And we were talking about learned helplessness and these components of learned helplessness. Correct. Are there kinds of family environments that make the abused child within them more helpless and less able to think of ways to get out of the situation? Sure. And specifically with respect to this family, the Menendez family. Yes. Were there factors in the environment of this family, apart from the specific traumatic things, the terrorizing things, and the sexual abuse, that would have endangered a great degree? I'm sorry, that would have engendered a great degree of helplessness, say in Erik Menendez? He says yes. So there were plenty of other factors besides the specific traumatic events that we know of, including terrorizing and sexual abuse. There were still other events that would make you believe that he may have that learned helplessness. Objection irrelevant, says Mr. Khan. The court says rephrase the question. Ms. Abramson says, okay, were there factors in the family dynamic in which Erik Menendez grew up that the literature indicates are particularly likely to result in learned helplessness? Yes. Would you describe, given the factual construct of this family, what those factors were? I'd like to highlight two major factors. First has to do with the personality and the personality and behavior of Mr. Menendez, the father, and secondly, the same for the mother, Mrs. Kitty Menendez, and then thirdly, the relationship between the two of them. First, to start with, Jose Menendez, he was a domineering, intimidating, forceful, imposing figure. He was a figure that instilled both fear and respect in the children, and specifically with Mr. Erik Menendez. On the one hand, his domineering, powerful success as a business person, his success in achieving material things, his personality of being both charismatic and intimidating and controlling and exercising power of attorney of relationships in this family, and as well as on the outside, made him a foreboding, powerful, dominating, impressive, and frightening figure for Mr. Erik Menendez. And yet, at the same time, he was charismatic. His charisma extended to his success, to a tendency to also have a capacity to relate with to relate well with people at times, to be charming. So we have this combination of characteristics that makes him, in a sense, a larger than life figure in terms of his personality for Erik Menendez. So that's one major factor, that he had this kind of personality. And as I mentioned, the behavioral component of it was that he experienced control and influence in Mr. Erik Menendez's life. Throw me off every time he says Mr. Erik Menendez. Um, if he exper- if he exercised decision making responsibility over every aspect of Erik Menendez's life, whether it was choice or sport or curriculum or what the family was going to do on a daily schedule. This too was controlled by Mr. Jose Menendez. Let me stop you right there for a moment. If you grew up your whole life, if a child grows up their whole life with a parent who always makes all of the decisions and grieves all of them, I'm sorry, can't read. Let me start that sentence over again. If you grow up your whole life, if a child grows up their whole life with a parent who always makes all of the decisions and gives all of the direction, how does that child develop a sense of problem solving or a sense of confidence that they can affect their environment or be off on their own or any of those things that we think of as maturity? It's often very difficult, says the witness, because the child isn't given the freedom or responsibilities or the opportunity to have experiences in school with friends, with others that would allow them to develop competencies and skills and abilities that would lead to more self confidence, more self esteem, more of a sense that the child can make that the child can make its own decisions and chart his or her own direction and exercise some influence about what they would like to do. Next question. So, does the child raised in that environment, simply where they're not given any of these options or any of these strengths developed in them, does it make any difference technically if they're 16 or 17 or 18 they haven't gone if they haven't gone through developmental stages that make you mature? No. Okay, you talked about Eric Menendez's personality. Apart from his personality and the control and decision making, were there other components of how he interacted with Eric Menendez at, that are the types of things that it is shown can lead to the development of learned helplessness, particularly with respect to self-reference issues, the self-image of the child? He says, yes, and I think for me, the clearest answer to what has to do with the fact that whether Eric Menendez succeeded or failed, he was typically met with punishment or admonitions that he could do better. So, no matter how he tried, whether he succeeded or failed, it didn't matter. He was always told, you need to try harder, you need to do better, whatever it is. Or that he wasn't doing well enough, or that his performance was inadequate, or that there were other things that he could or should have done that would have made a difference. And that applies to virtually every aspect of his development, whether it was in school, whether it was in sports, or whether it was in the context of family. And so if you tell a child they're inadequate or they're a sissy, a coward, a weakling, not a true member of the family, dumb, dummy, stupid in a family where there's otherwise they're being controlled, does that work to cripple the child? Objection leading and argumentative. I'll withdraw it, Your Honor. He says, all right. She asks, if we're talking about an abusive environment to begin with and a lot of domination and control, as you have described it, what role, if anything, does constant belittling and humiliating and name calling and telling the child that they're worthless and second rate and all the rest of that? What, if anything, does that contribute to an utter sense of helplessness or a sense of helplessness? Objection, irrelevant. Rephrase the question again. This is so stupid. Ms. Abramson says, does this surrounding environment of being put down, degenerated? Um, oh my God. I need to slow down. I need to go stretch and slow down. I'll come back in 1 second. I need to wake my brain up or my eyes. I don't know what it is. I'm kind of recording early today, so maybe I'm just not awake enough. But my eyes read the word so fast, but it like denigrated is the word, but I said degenerated. I like it just my eyes. I swear to God, I have dyslexia that developed late in life because I never had this early on. Can that happen? Does anybody know? Anyways, let me take a break. I'll be right back. All right. Sorry about that. I have stretched. I had a little snack. Now let's see if I can get through these words without screwing them up so badly. Let's try that again. Ms. Abramson asks, does this surrounding environment of being put down, denigrated, being told you're not worthwhile, does that contribute to a sense of helplessness? Yes. And was there information, what you have just described about Mr. Menendez's role in the family and treatment of Erik Menendez, where did you get that information from? It came from a number of sources. It came from relatives. It came from teachers. Those are the two principal sources. So it's not just from Erik. This was people in Erik's life that he got the source from. Miss Abramson asks, did you also read statements given by people who worked with Mr. Menendez who described how he treated weaker people? Yes, I did. Remember that came into testimony in the first trial that he was not a nice person at work either. So he was very controlling, very moody, you didn't want to upset him or anger him. He was once he had his mind set on something, you didn't cross him. Was what you learned from those sources consistent with what you learned from relatives and teachers and others who saw him interact with Erik and how he treated Erik? Yes. Based on all the information that you had about the family, did it appear that Erik Menendez was the weakest member of the family? And he says yes, sorry. And does it appear that Mr. Menendez treated him worse than anybody else in the family? Yes. Was that a pattern that he treated the weakest people the worst? Yes. Now, is a component of learned helplessness in humans the equivalent of what the rats on the grid were doing? Is that what we call in humans passivity? Yes. So acting passive. Yes. And does passivity mean contentment? No. Does it mean you're not aroused or you're not suffering or you're not frightened? No. Does it mean happy? No. What does it mean? It means passivity, the absence of responsiveness, passive responding to one's environment in a number of contexts and situations. If you've grown up with a parent who is the kind of charismatic person you're described with Jose Menendez, and you're used to having that person make all your decisions for you, is it consistent that you would be passive when he continues to make those decisions into your teenage years? No, it is not. Is it inconsistent that you would be passive? So no, you would still continue to be passive. Now, you said another component of the surrounding environment in this family could lead to the development of helplessness. you described the personality of Mr. Menendez. Have you finished describing the behavior that you think could lead to helplessness? The behavior that leads to helplessness not only includes the domination, the control, the power, the constant management of the schedule, but also the use of intimidating threats and coercion, verbal denigration, and statements to the effect that the behaviors and performances of Mr. Erik Menendez don't measure up. They're not, and they're not good enough in terms of what the Mr. Menendez is expecting of his son. So the combination then of the domination, the intimidation, the power, the coercion, the verbal assault, the management style, coupled with the absence of positive rewards, positive attention, demonstrations of love, verbal statements of encouragement and adoration and respect, then combined to lead to not only the passivity, but I think the learned helplessness as well. Now, this is even in the absence of reference to the sexual molestation. That's correct. Does that research indicate the chronic sexual molestation of children can lead to learned helplessness to where you get children incapable of making decisions? Yes. Incapable of extricating themselves from the situation? Yes. And that's not only in households where you have this other domineering dynamic. Is that true? Yes. Does the research in child development indicate that children are easy to manipulate with threats when they are when they are young? It does. Now you have also indicated that there were components that led to that were consistent with the development of learned helplessness with respect to the personality and behavior of Mr. Menendez, Mrs. Menendez. That's correct. Could you tell us what those were? Yes, there are a number of components in terms of Mrs. Kitty Menendez. Number one is that she was the partner of Jose in terms of the child rearing, and as a partner, concurred and carried out the wishes of her husband. Let me repeat that. She concurred and carried out the wishes of Jose, which included such things as making notes and lists of what Mr. Erik Menendez did wrong in terms of school or performance, reporting to her husband problems or behaviors associated with Erik's activities during the days. In this regard, she was serving as a kind of associate in carrying out the wishes of her husband, Jose. Secondly, there were characteristics of her own behavior as well. She was not demonstratively affectionate or warm towards Erik. She was cold, aloof, distant, and hard to get close to. Furthermore, well, now let me just stop you there for a minute. Yes? Are you basing those conclusions about her on what Erik Menendez said to you, or what he has testified to, or what other people who saw the family testified to and indicated in statements? Well, actually, it's both. But there's a broad range of other people besides Mr. Erik Menendez. If Erik Menendez had said nothing about his mother being cold, aloof, distant, non demonstrative, if he had never commented on that, would you have ample evidence of that from the other witnesses? Certainly. Go ahead. Yes. So, in addition to those characteristics, his attempts to get close to his mother to secure her approval, her love, her affection, her recognition, her praise, her respect were rebuffed. And not only rebuffed, but at times actually denigrated or made fun of. So, that was the characteristic of Mrs. Menendez, is that she was, in a very real sense, not available to mother him, but available to him only in the larger context of her relationship with her husband in terms of how Erik Menendez was to be disciplined, how he was to be raised, how he was to be related to by the parents in terms of all areas of his activity, school, friends, family, in interpersonal relationships. Those are some of the hallmark features of Mrs. Menendez, but there are others as well that I think I should mention, and that is that she was prone from time to time to outbursts of anger and irritability, would become hostile and enraged with threatening gestures such as clenched fists and a grimace on her face towards Erik Menendez. So that kind of behavior, in addition to her personality, characteristics, and traits on an ongoing basis, coupled with her relationship with her husband, helped to create this environment that led to not only Erik Menendez's passivity, but his broader psychological development or lack of it. When you said that she was a partner with her husband, I mean, aren't all of us moms partners with our husbands in raising our kids? What's significant about the partnership here? That's a good question. The witness responds, the partnership here is that she was an extension of Mr. Jose Menendez. She carried out his wishes. The partnership was she did what he wanted. Well, do you know if it was what she wanted also? I don't know. I don't know for sure if it's what she wanted. She may have wanted the same things based on the behavior that you are aware of. She may have, yes. So it wasn't one of those situations where a child being threatened with punishment from one parent runs to the other and gets out of it, negotiates separate terms, as it were. Yes. The kind of things most kids do. Yes. And most kids are able to do. Yes. And are you aware of information that Mrs. Menendez did Erik's schoolwork frequently? Yes. Did his homework? Yes. Made out all of his college applications for him? Yes. Arranged all of his tennis engagements and tournaments? Yes. Budgeted him on an allowance? Yes. And are these behaviors part of what contributes to a kid never getting a sense of being able to do anything for himself? Correct. People call it spoiling. Some people call it that. Is it indulgence? Is it good for parents to do every single thing like this for them? Consequence is that the child doesn't learn to do these things for themselves. So the net effect is if the child doesn't learn how to take care of those things in their life, they learn to depend on someone else to do them for them. Let me show you a document. This hasn't been marked yet. Your Honor, I have what appears to be a set of official records from the California Department of Motor Vehicles. Mr. Khan says, I would object at this point. We haven't had any opportunity to review these documents. The court says, okay, then why don't you go on to something else then? Ms. Abramson says, I am only going to use one page. I will show it to counsel. The court says, if you haven't showed it to the prosecution yet, Ms. Abramson says he subpoenaed them. He looked at them first. Mr. Khan says, I'm going to object to counsel arguing on the record without having an opportunity to respond. I'm going to object to the argument. The court says the argument is addressed to the court and with the understanding that counsel may not use the document without it being evaluated by everybody. Let's go on to something else. Ms. Abramson says, let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say you have a 17-year-old young man who gets a traffic ticket for not having a license in his possession, and he has to make out a form to the Department of Motor Vehicles explaining why. And he's 17 years old, and he's on the tennis team, number 1 on the tennis team in his high school. This is an example, okay? Okay. And his mother makes out the form explaining to the DMV. Objection assumes facts, not an evidence. Sustained. She's using a hypothetical. She says, say I lost my wallet. Sustained, says the court. The objection is sustained. Let's move on to something else. Entirely different? The court says yes. Ms. Abramson says, we can talk about the weather, Your Honor. The court says the whole hypothetical is stricken. Let's move on to something else. Ms. Abramson says, all right. That's weird because you are supposed to be able to testify in hypotheticals, but apparently not today. Now, we were talking about the environment here. That in addition to the helplessness that's caused by being repeatedly traumatized, that also contributed to the sense of helplessness, and you were talking about the personality and behavior of Mrs. Menendez that contributed to that. It is a component of the development of helplessness, this sense of lack of control over bad things that can happen? Yes. Is one of the problems that the literature indicates about alcoholic parents that their behavior is so unpredictable? Yes. What's the relationship between unpredictability of behavior and harm to the children of such parents? Objection, vague and irrelevant. The court says sustained to the form of the question. Ms. Abramson says, is there evidence that you're aware of both from testimony in this trial and testimony in the last trial and statements of witnesses, that Mrs. Menendez's rages were unpredictable. Yes. And how does that create a sense of helplessness if it does? It creates a sense of helplessness in the child because they don't know when the rage is going to happen. It's hard to predict because it may come at a random interval. There is no way to know on any given day, at any given time, at any given hour, when that rage is going to take place. In this case, a rage or hostile outbreak. When there is an unpredictability, it makes the child very anxious about what's going to happen next or when it's going to happen next. Is a component of developed learning helplessness even exposed to is a component of developing learned helplessness being exposed to situations over which you have no real control? Yes. And this is noted in victims of disasters? Yes, it is. And it's been noted that even in the same natural disaster, one person may develop PTSD and this helplessness component, whereas another does not. Yes. Has there been any distinctions noted about why some do and why some don't? Yes. Can you give us an example of that with respect to this notion of control? Sure. The distinction is whether or not the person who is in the traumatic event believes that they have some capacity to influence or change or address the trauma that they are experiencing. For example, I have more than one patient who was in the same airplane crash. It was an airplane crash that killed about half the people on the plane, and one of my patients, a man in his 30s, an executive, was thrown out of the plane, still belted in his seat, and his seat landed outside the airplane and turned upside down, with him still strapped into it. He was also burned from the flames. He was seriously injured, but obviously didn't die. While he was turned over, he managed to unbuckle himself and try to right himself, which he was partly successful in doing, but he was badly injured and couldn't move. And while he was on the ground, he could still hear people in the crashed plane screaming for help, and he could smell the fuel from the plane. The plane had exploded, it was on fire, and there was these horrific, obviously, sounds from those who were trying to escape. Another patient I have from the same crash was able to get himself out of the plane, was injured mildly, but was able to flee the crash and also to assist other people in getting off the plane. Now, there is a difference between these two patients. It's the exact same crash. They're both the same age. They're both professional people. The one who was able to help other people and to help himself get off the plane had much less severe post-traumatic symptomology than did the one who was rendered passive and helpless by his injuries outside the plane, meaning this helplessness is directly tied to being in a situation where you have no control, a situation where you're basically in a passive, non-responsive situation, you feel helpless. That's where that learned helplessness comes in. And that serves to illustrate, I think, that you can have these different types of outcomes depending on whether or not the person sees that they have a capacity to respond and whether that capacity to respond will not only help themselves but other people in this example. Ms. Abramson asks, when children are sexually molested by an older, more powerful person, is that a situation that's perceived psychologically as totally out of their control? Would you repeat that question for me? Yeah, when children are sexually molested by older, powerful adults from a psychological standpoint, does the child perceive that as being in a situation where they have absolutely no control? It really depends on the child and it depends on the situation. Some children certainly would perceive it that way. Others, depending on the nature of the abuse, might see that they have a way to do something about it. Well, if they make efforts to do something about it, but they can't stop the abuse, is that what leads to the development, or can that lead to the development of learned helplessness? Yes. Were there Are there things that children try to do to avoid abuse, sometimes rather feeble looking from the outside, the efforts that they engage in? Yes. Are you aware of any efforts that Erik Menendez relates that he engaged in that are similar to these kinds of feeble efforts to avoid the sexual abuse? Yes. And what are those? They included things such as hiding under the bed, hiding in the closet, putting cinnamon in his father's coffee, squeezing lemon juice onto his meals, in particular meat. These are a few examples. And what he's trying to do is avoid some of the unpleasant aspects of the abuse by using lemon on his food and putting cinnamon in his father's coffee? Correct. Did he indicate he thought the cinnamon in his father's coffee would somehow flavor his father's semen so it wouldn't taste so bad to him? Correct. Did you also receive information he either through his interviews with you or his testimony or his interviews with Dr. Vickery that in the more violent encounters with his father he cried? Yes. Is crying by children considered protest behavior or can it be considered protest behavior? It certainly can be considered protest behavior, sure. Is that a feeble example of efforts by the child to stop something? Yes. Does the literature indicate whether or not children who are being molested typically physically resist and fight and attack their abusers? No, they do not. Do most abused teenagers? No. Do people who are teenagers and have been abused over the course of their childhood run away from home? No. Do most sexually molested children, even when they become teenagers, run away from home? No. Some do, but most do not. In the clinical community and the psychological community, if a child doesn't run away from home, does that mean they weren't molested? No. If they don't run away from home, does that mean they weren't abused? No. Is learned helplessness one of the concepts that's used in the psychological community to understand why abused children don't just up and leave? Yes. Now, does it matter in an analysis from the standpoint of learned helplessness if the person is 6 feet tall or 5 feet tall? I'm not sure what you're asking. The abused person, does their size matter as to whether or not they develop feelings of helplessness? Not that I'm aware of. Does the fact that they're 18 versus 17 matter? No. Does the fact that is learned helplessness a characteristic of battered women? It is. Does it matter what the age of the woman is? No. Now, does it even matter how long she's been in the abusive relationship? No. Are there instances of people who can be in abusive relationships who learn to be helpless in 6 months? Yes. Are you aware of the testimony that was given in this courtroom from Erik and Lyle Menendez, cousin Diane Vandermolen? Yes. Are you aware of the testimony in which she described going from one psychological state to 6 months later being in the state of mind where she wanted to take her own life and not knowing how to deal with the situation? Yes. Objection irrelevant. Sustained. The answer stricken. Whatever. I think you have indicated that one of the psychological states that often accompany learned helplessness is depression. Correct. Is the thinking of wanting to take your own life often affiliated with depression? Yes. Now, there is a large body of literature now about battered women and their experiences, is there not? Correct. And a large and growing body of literature about abused and molested children and their experiences. Correct. And based on that literature, are threats of harm directed by abusers to their victims in abusive relationships, particularly directed at threats of harm if the victim leaves, a common way of controlling the victim's behavior? Objection irrelevant. Rephrase the question, says the court. Okay. Is there, particularly in the literature of battered women, an indication that many women stay in abusive relationships because they have been threatened with dire consequences if they leave? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Are you kidding? Ms. Abramson says, are threats of consequences if abuse secrets are told, understand, or understood to be effective when the threats have been made against children? Objection irrelevant. Rephrase the question. This is garbage that she can't ask anything. She's having a hard time getting any of her questions out because everything's being objected to right now because we're talking about the abuse and the state doesn't want the abuse in. Clearly, they don't. So Ms. Abramson asks, I have already asked you if children are particularly subject to control by threats. That's correct. Do children tend to keep secrets of abuse? Yes. Do children keep secrets of abuse even when they're not threatened? Yes. Do they keep secrets of abuse when they are threatened? Yes. Is the current state of understanding in the psychological community that most children or most child molestation is reported? Is most objection leading overruled, says the court. The witness says, would you repeat the question, please? She says, yes. Is most of the sexual molestation that the psychological community believes is occurring in this country reported? No. Is that because the victims like it? Of course not. Why is it, or what is the belief of the psychological community about why most child abuse, and specifically, well, let me ask you this. Is most sexual abuse of children who are old enough to talk about it reported? No. What is the understanding about why most of the sexual abuse of children old enough to describe it and talk about it, what is the understanding of why it is not reported? The general clinical understanding about why it is not reported is that there are secrets. These that the child has been ensnared or entrapped into keeping a secret, and that the secret, if it's revealed, has harmful consequences to the child who would reveal it. It could be a threat of being killed, a threat of the parent leaving the family, a threat of the family breaking up, a threat that the mother will leave the family. There are various types of threats that are commonly associated with the keeping of secrets, specifically among children who are old enough to report it, and for that reason, they don't disclose it. So it is severely, severely underreported. Ms. Abramson asks, apart from actual threats or inducements to keep the secret, are there also understood to be psychological issues about how children who are being molested think about how they think about their role in the molestation that helps to maintain silence about it? Yes, there are at least two interrelated roles related to the silence. One has to do with what's called in the literature role reversal, where the child begins to assume the role of the parent, that they are the one who provides the love, the nurturing, the sex, and that's an expectation that the child is to take care of the parent who's doing the sexual molestation. So you have this kind of role reversal that's part of the psychological abuse that takes place in sexual molestation. What does that have to do with not reporting it, though, if the child is taking care of the parents? Is it because they feel protective? Is that what you mean? They feel protective, yes, but also not only do they feel protective, there is usually accompanying that the threat revealing the secret. But there is another co-component as well, and that component is for many children who have had repeated sexual molestation. The abnormal becomes normal, and what I mean is that that's what they have come to know. That's the reality. That's their world. You have grown up in the context of this abusive relationship where sex is love, sex is affection, sex equals, or sexual molestation is the way in which is the way it is in the family. Sorry, it's just the way it is in the family. They don't understand often for many years later that there's nothing or something wrong with what was going on. To them, that's the way it is. That's the way their family is. They often assume that other families are the same way. And children, we know it's only when the abused child is able to extricate themselves from that situation that they even have the capacity to begin to recognize that their childhood experience wasn't normal when the kind of sexual molestation took place in that context. I'm going to pause for 1 second because this is a clever thing that he's saying here. You don't know you're in an abusive, sometimes many people don't know they're in an abusive situation, or you don't know how bad it is until you have time to reflect when you're out of that situation. So I'm going to tell you my own personal, my ex-husband was very verbally, emotionally manipulative, abusive. I had to walk on eggshells, whatever you want to call it. He was horrible. So, um, it took me Probably a couple months. Not that long though. I mean, a lot of self-reflection, but it took me a little while. And I started realizing like, okay, I was in like I knew at the time it was abusive, but I didn't really like I didn't do research on abusive relationships or anything like that. I just was like, okay, it is what it is, whatever. But once I started to reflect, learn more about narcissists and and personality disorders and things like that, I really started understanding my situation better, and I realized just how bad it was. And it took me a little while. It took some time. It took perspective away from the situation to really see to see the situation for what it was. It took me to be away from that situation for a little while in order to come to those conclusions. So for a child, when that's all you know and that's all you've ever grown up with, it's going to be even harder for them to break out of these ways of thinking themselves and about their relationships with their parents. It's not their fault that this happened. And sometimes, you think like, how did I get to be in this situation? And sometimes you're just like, well, I guess I deserve it. This is where I'm supposed to be. But that was never the situation with the brothers, and it's quite sickening that the state defends Jose and Kitty so hard twice in two trials. So anyways, let's continue. I gotta fix my shirt. I have a heart monitor on, and I've got to wear it for a couple more days, hopefully. I have to take it off soon. All right. So, is it indicated in the literature that if children do talk about it while they're still in the relationship, that often what they're doing is seeking from other children's feedback about, is this normal? Is this happening to you? Yes. Is that a typical way in which children who do reveal abuse go about revealing it? Objection, irrelevant. Overruled, says the court. The witness says yes. Are you aware that in this particular case, testimony and statements by Erik Menendez's cousin, Andy Cano, that Erik did broach the subject of being molested by his father to Andy in just that way? Has this happened to you? Does this go on between you and your father? Yes, says the witness. When Erik Menendez was 13 years old, he told Andy Cano. At some point in we'll strike that. At some point in a child's chronological development, do children typically figure out that if they're having sex with a parent, something is wrong? At some point, they do figure out it's wrong. So eventually, they learn that this kind of behavior is not a normal thing between a father and a son. And it probably comes around, puberty age-ish, maybe, when little kids start talking about sex and things, and it probably comes like sometime after that. She says, in puberty, do they get that sense, or in the teenage years, do they get that sense? Yes, the literature tells us that it's usually about the onset of puberty that they know there is something wrong, there's something not quite right about what's happening to them. Is that understood to be partly attributable to the fact that they're now older and they understand what's going on in the world, that these things are talked about? That's one component. That they have more intellectual development, they have more cognitive development, they have a greater capacity to think and to reflect about what's happening. That's a developmental component, but there are other components as well. Abramson asks, and is it found that children, even at that age, when they know it's not normal, don't report it because of shame? Yes. Is it particularly true of boys who have been molested by a male relative that they are particularly reluctant to ever reveal that to anyone? Correct. So even if the absence of threats is harm from psychological standpoint, is it likely that a teenage boy would have revealed that he had been having sex with his father for a period of years? Objection calls for speculation. Sustained. Based on your understanding, says Ms. Abramson, of adolescent self-image needs and the effects of molestation on children, is it unlikely to expect teenage boys to reveal same-sex incest? Calls for speculation, says Mr. Khan. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, does the research indicate that few such children do reveal same-sex incest? Yes. Would it be fair to say that much of the revealing of child molestation secrets takes place when the child becomes adults and when they're in therapy? Yes. So that's when you start talking about it. Is much of what is known about child abuse based on what the reports of children, but not on the reports of children, but on the reports of adults who were molested as children? That's correct. So it isn't until adulthood when you start usually seeking treatment or talking about these things, even. Based on your clinical experience and the research, and I take it also training materials for clinicians, is even an adult, is it difficult for most adults to reveal child abuse from their past? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Is the revelation of abuse histories by patient a process? Yes. Objection irrelevant. Sustained. The answer is stricken. Ms. Abramson says, based on your experience and knowledge, Dr. Wilson, would you expect that an abused person goes to a therapist, that an abused person who goes to a therapist to spill it all in their first session with their therapist? Is that typical behavior? Objection irrelevant. Rephrase the question, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, is it typical for abuse victims who seek therapy as adults to just pour out the abuse, when coming in contact with a therapist? Objection irrelevant. Overruled. You can answer the question. The witness says the answer is, on the contrary, they rarely reveal the components of their sexual abuse early in the psychotherapy. There is a great deal of reticence to disclose that this has happened to them in their life. And in my experience, most patients with that history of child abuse, when they come to treatment as adults, generally present with other problems, such as marital problems, problems on the job, problems with self-image. The sexual abuse comes later in the course of the treatment in terms of disclosure of those experiences. So even if you do go to a therapist to talk about it, your abuse, it's going to be the last thing you actually address, probably. You're going to talk about all your other like little minor issues and things here and there before you get to the abuse part of it. So they disclose it last, asks Ms. Abramson. He says, not always last, but it's not in the first phase of treatment as a rule. When you say people with presenting problems, when people come for therapy, they tell you what they think is bothering them, right? They come because they have a problem. Well, they feel a problem. Something is wrong with them. They feel a problem. That's correct. And they don't come in and say, hey, I was sexually abused as a child and that's why I'm drinking too much. Correct. They say, I'm drinking too much. Correct. And with respect to people who are suffering from post traumatic stress disorder, do they necessarily come in and tell you, I have this problem and it's because I was nearly blown up in the war? No. Do they identify for you the fact that they're suffering from something that happened to them in the past? Objection irrelevant. Overruled. The witness says, no, most patients do not do that. Ms. Abramson says, no, you have been called upon, Dr. Wilson, to evaluate people in a number of court cases. Correct. Do you know how many? No. Whoops, I'm trying to turn the fan off. I'm hitting the wrong button. All right. Do you know how many cases you've been involved in? No, I have an accurate count, probably 100 or more. He says I don't have an accurate account. My eyes need to slow the F down and let my tongue catch up. When you're contacted, when you're contacted to do an evaluation, do you do it and you agree to do it? Do you do it with no promises made as to whether or not your evaluation is going to be helpful to the side that they're contacting you? That's right. Do you encounter people, defendants in criminal cases or plaintiffs or defendants in civil cases who tell you, gee, Dr. Wilson, I got PTSD and here's the symptoms? Yes, I have had that several times. And do you find, is there something notable of that method of reporting to you? Yes. What's notable about it? What's notable about it is that in these cases where the person is reporting in this manner, they usually present by telling me that they have post traumatic stress disorder. They use other words. Dr. Wilson, I have post traumatic stress disorder. In several cases where I have been where have blah, in several cases where I have done evaluations, they actually have the DSM on the desk and have it marked and then start to tell right away which of the diagnostic symptoms they have, and then they make the linkage to some event they allege happened or has happened in their past that's been traumatic. In more than one case, in fact, careful examination found they had no trauma history whatsoever. So when someone starts to present by telling me immediately how they fit the diagnostic criteria for post traumatic stress disorder and start to delve immediately into their trauma story, I am a little bit suspicious because that's not the way most people who have trauma present when they're hurting, when they're suffering from the disorder. Generally, there is a great deal of reticence to talk about the traumatic experience in bona fide cases. The person is often in intense distress. It's often very hard for them to describe what they went through. So, when I have evaluated in the past, both in criminal and safely cases, by the way, that's the kind of presentation you see. Okay, now you are aware that in this particular case, you are not the first mental health professional to have evaluated Erik or to have talked about the traumatic experiences of his past. That's correct. Are you aware of who the first mental health person is who did that? That'd be Dr. Vickery. Dr. Vickery, shout out, he was in the first trial too. And are you aware that Dr. Vickery is on the defense witness list for this trial? That's correct. And in all likelihood, unless there is an objection, he will testify. I would object to this question, says Mr. Khan. I'm sorry, the court says sustained. Ms. Abramson says, are you aware that Dr. Vickery testified in the previous trial? Yes. And do you know when it was that Dr. Vickery started to see Erik Menendez? It was in 1990, I think it was. 1990. I would have to go look at my notes. Well, a matter of weeks or months later, a few months after Erik Menendez was arrested. That's correct. And examining Dr. Vickery's notes, does it appear that Erik Menendez announced to Dr. Vickery, gee, I was abused as a kid, and here's how. And here is when, and presented to Dr. Vickery in the way that you have talked about some people presenting to you. He did not. Well, there's like thousands of examples he could give. So what's the point? It's all in written word. So I don't know why they need a picture. Why he's upset if they didn't get a picture. Next question is now, when and you know that Dr. Ann Burgess evaluated Erik Menendez in the past and she was available to testify at the previous trial. Yes? And did she testify? Yes. Did you know who Dr. Burgess was before you became involved in this case? Yes. Who is she? Dr. Ann Burgess is an advanced professor of psychiatric nursing at the University of Pennsylvania and is a major contributor to the field of post-traumatic stress disorder, in particular in the area of our word trauma syndrome. So she is someone who has been involved in sexual assault trauma research for many, many years? Correct. Did you read her testimony from the first trial? Yes. Could you determine from her testimony whether or not when Erik Menendez was interviewed by her, he said anything to the effect of, gee, Dr. Burgess, you know, I am suffering from this and that, and here are my symptoms? Objection calls for hearsay. Overruled. The witness says, please repeat the question. Ms. Abramson says, okay. If you don't recall, can we get back to this if you need to review her testimony again. But do you remember Dr. Burgess testifying about how Erik presented to her when she interviewed him for the 60 or 80 hours that she sat with him? Yes. Did she indicate to you that he did the thing that you say makes you very suspicious and gee, I was abused or I was molested and there are symptoms? Objection calls for hearsay. Court says right is being offered for the truth of the matter, or the truth of what was said. Ms. Amerson says, no, Your Honor. The court says, okay, then it won't be received for the truth of what was said, just the facts that this witness read it and relied upon it, and for no other reason. Ms. Amerson says, exactly, Your Honor. The witness says, right. The court says, you may answer the question. The witness says, no. Now, what it's been Now what? It's been so long since the question, says Ms. Abramson. Uh, and the witness says he didn't present that way. He didn't get the DSM-4 out to Dr. Burgess and say, I have PTSD from my family. Well, even short of saying he had PTSD, did she ever say that he said that I was abused or here are my symptoms or anything like that? No. Now, when you became involved in this case, it was after the first trial, correct? That's correct. And so he did not testify in the first trial. And you had available to you the transcripts of that trial and all the testimony therein? Yes. Including Erik Menendez's testimony? Yes. And you also had the testimony of the expert witnesses who testified on his behalf in that trial? Yes. Now, when you want to evaluate Mr. Menendez, did you see him in the county jail? Yes. When you started talking to him, what was the manner in which he discussed with you that what had happened to him in his childhood? I'm not sure what your question is. Well, did he try to convince you that he had suffered abuse or had symptoms? Calls for speculation as to what his intent was. Court says rephrase the question. Ms. Abramson says, as he talked about it himself or his history in terms of, well, first of all, did he ever use the word abuse? No. Did he ever talk about things that had happened to him as a list of traumatic events? No. As a list of abusive acts? No. Mr. Khan says objection vague. Overruled. Ms. Abramson says, did he tell you that he had symptoms? No. Of anything in particular? No, is the answer. Did he tell you that he had symptoms at all? No. Can you describe the way in which, first of all, did he discuss with you the facts of the sexual activity between himself and his father? He did. Can you describe the way in which he discussed that information or any other information about his childhood that was significant to you? Objection, irrelevant. The court says it's vague. The question is vague. Ms. Abramson says, could we have our recess right now, Your Honor, and I will try to be less vague. Court says, all right, we will take a recess. We'll resume in 10 minutes after the hour. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. 10 minutes after. So we're coming back from their afternoon recess. Court says, all right, are we ready to resume? Miss Abramson says, yes, Your Honor. The court says, get the jury out, please. The jury enters the room. The court says, you may continue. Miss Abramson says, I just wanted to go back for a moment to the concept of helplessness, learned helplessness. Is there such a thing clinically observed among people in abusive relationships called rescue fantasy? Like thinking someone's going to rescue them, like the damsel trapped in the tower, thinking the prince is going to come get her, kind of thing. Objection irrelevant. Overruled. Yes, says the witness. What is a rescue fantasy? Objection irrelevant. Overruled, says the court. The witness says a rescue fantasy is a fantasy that a child has or a victim may have from another trauma source in which there's going to be a way out. The situation that's abusive or traumatic. It's fantasy. It often takes a visual imagery form in which they envision a scenario that's going to allow themselves to escape or get out of the situation that's so unpleasant for them. So even that rescue fantasy could be their themselves rescuing themselves. Could be them finding a way out. Ms. Amerson says, can rescue fantasies be based on the expectation of future events in their life? Sure. And in this particular case, in reviewing statements that Erik Menendez has made, both on the witness stand and in talking to you and others, did he describe thoughts and expectations on his part that you would call a rescue fantasy? Yes. And what was it that, what you called a rescue fantasy for him? What I would call the rescue fantasy for Erik Menendez was the possibility of going away to college, that by leaving the home, going away to college, living in a dormitory, being away from his father, in particular, that the sexual molestation would stop and that he would go on with his life without sexual molestation. And it was fantasy to envision this change taking place in the near future for him in '89, that he was going to go away to college. When you say go away, you understand that he was going to go to college here in Los Angeles and not live at home. Yes. Now, is there anything in the description that you obtained from him or that you saw he had given to other people that indicated that he had any kind of rescue fantasy or longings to have no contact whatsoever with his parents? No. In fact, in your talking to him, did he indicate his feelings as of back in '89 about having a continuing relationship with his parents? Yes. What was it that was related to you? There was a number of things that were related to me by Mr. Menendez. One was that he would go to college and complete a course of studies oriented around business and law, and that after doing so, that he and his brother would join their father in a common business venture that was going to take place in Florida. That what was related to me by Erik Menendez is that his father had indicated to him there was a plan to purchase land in Florida, specifically an island. Epstein, anybody? He wanted to buy an island in Florida? Tell me he's not part of the whole big criminal organization somehow. He was gonna go to Florida and become a senator and buy an island. This dude's already a perv. You know he is. So what's he doing buying an island in Florida? In the Florida area? In the little what's Schmepstein's Island, Little John something. Could be near there, you know? Could be a place to do some more nefarious things that we don't want to know that he was involved in or wanted to get involved in, but maybe he has some higher connections to the powers that be in this world who aren't the good guys necessarily. He wanted to purchase an island, specifically in Florida, that would start a business enterprise there. Could it be trafficking children kind of enterprise there? Because we know that that is going on in that vicinity. And that Erik would be part of that enterprise in the future. I'm just thinking here. I mean, just there's too many coincidences, and I don't believe in coincidences. He worked for a large record company. He was like the exec of a large record company. He mingled and talked with celebrities and other higher ups, other agents, other managers, and people of his caliber in his business, right? Let's think about this. There have been many managers of boy bands and things that have been accused of sexually assaulting their clients. We know that Jose Menendez sexual or allegedly, but I believe it happened, allegedly sexually assaulted Roselio. Um, what's his name? Roy Roselio from Menudo. He's come out with, very detailed graphic uh, details of what he suffered from by Jose Menendez, and that's all in court documents. And I believe he wrote a letter to the brothers for their court case or something. I don't remember. We read the letter, but I can't remember what it was for. Anyways, so he all of that combined, and he wanted to become a senator. He wanted to buy land, maybe an island. He wanted to do business enterprise down there. Think about it. It just makes sense that he was part of this, whatever you want to call it, higher up, Masonic, Illuminati, whatever you want to call it. I'm probably going to get struck for saying all these words, but I think he was a part of it. I really do. I wonder how he got all of his money. I wonder if there were some dishonest things he had to do there to get it, or if maybe he just had connections with the right people. I don't know. But, anyways, very interesting answer right there to me. Next question. Did he indicate to you that this was a future that he wanted to avoid or he didn't want to participate in? No. Did he talk to you about the fact that his father was being typically involved on a very high level in a selection of classes that he was going to take in high school or in college? Yes, he did. Did he indicate to you whether or not that was a problem for him? Yes, he did. And what did he say in that regard? That it was somewhat of a problem because his own inclinations were to take courses not necessarily limited to business and economics and law, that he had interests in other areas as well, philosophy, art, drama, theater, and these were interests for him, that they weren't interests that met the approval of his father. Did he indicate, however, that he went along with his father's decisions? Yes. Would that be unusual given this family history for him to passively accept his father's decisions? Not at all. And was based on events that occurred in that last week before the homicide, was the rescue fantasy, as you've identified this set of expectations that Erik Menendez had, destroyed? Yes. So that rescue fantasy of I'm going to go away to college, I'm not going to be home every night, my dad's not going to be able to come to my room every night, and that's his fantasy, to get out of the house. That's what's keeping him alive. That's what's making him continue to go to push through every day. That's what's motivating him. And that just got crushed when Jose was like, "You think you're going to stay there 7 nights a week? That's a no-go. You're going to be here several nights a week, young man." That's a heartbreaker. That crushed his fantasy, his escape fantasy. Was that based on events that occurred in the last week before the homicide? I think I read this already. He says yes. And typically, if a person in an abusive situation has been looking at one perspective set of occurrences to get him out, and then that fantasy or future fantasy is destroyed, does that have a psychological impact on the person? Yes. What kind of impact? Objection calls for speculation. Sustained. From what was reported to you, did the destruction of this rescue fantasy, the inability to escape the molestation, even when he started college, have a psychological impact on Erik? Objection irrelevant, calls for speculation, no foundation, and that was sustained as to the form of the question. Would the destruction of such a rescue fantasy increase a sense of helplessness? Objection calls for speculation. Sustained. Are these rescue fantasies caused because the person feels otherwise helpless to deal with the situation? Yes. Is that how they're understood? Is that what they flow from? Yes. So, can you say if a person has a rescue fantasy and it's destroyed, whether or not that's likely to have a psychological impact? Objection calls for speculation. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, well, Your Honor, I'd like to be heard on that. The court says, let's move on to something else. He never lets her be heard. But if it's like Mr. Levin, he let Mr. Levin be heard many times. But in this case, he constantly ignores Ms. Abramson. Her next question is, did Erik Menendez tell you after this expectation of his was clearly not going to happen that he felt extraordinarily depressed? Yes, he did. That he had thoughts of taking his own life? Yes, he did. Is that kind of reaction to the destruction of rescue fantasy consistent with a person who basically feels helpless? Yes. Now, you had testified last week that you reviewed a large number of documents of different types, basically looking to see if there was evidence in them that could be interpreted as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder in Erik Menendez when he was a child. Correct. And you indicated that there was indication in some records of opinions that he suffered from attention deficit disorder. Yes. Objection. Calls for speculation. No foundation. Overruled. It's in his records. It's in the stuff that he reviewed. There should be plenty. Oh my God. It doesn't need foundation. Um, the witness says yes. Ms. Abramson says, and do you recall specifically what document it was that indicated that opinion? Yes. What was it? It was the records from the Lewis School. Was the Lewis School the school for learning disabilities? Yes, it was. And was it your understanding that Erik Menendez attended approximately 4 weeks at that school in the summer of '86? Yes, starting in July. And were there, to the best of your knowledge, some tests that were administered to him on learning and developing issues? That's correct, there were. And were there other tests that the school wanted to do that they were not permitted to do by Mrs. Menendez? Objection calls for speculation. Sustained, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, was a full battery of psychological tests administered based on records of the Lewis School that you have? No. Now, I think I asked you last week whether there is research now that tends to show that attention deficit disorder is often a diagnosis that actually is masking post-traumatic disorder, stress disorder. So ADD can mask PTSD? Is that what he's saying? Objection calls for speculation. All right. At this point, says the court, you just asked, you're phrasing something as though you had said it once before, asked it once before, so it's irrelevant. Why don't you ask a direct question? Ms. Aronson says, since you were here last, did you specifically pull the research that shows a linkage between diagnoses, particularly prior to the late 80s, of attention deficit disorder in children, where the research is now indicating it's more likely post-traumatic stress disorder? Yes. So it's not ADD, but it was PTSD, perhaps. And what is the connection? Well, what does research indicate is the reason why post-traumatic stress disorder can look like ADD in children? The reason PTSD can look like ADD in children is that some of the symptoms of PTSD can overlap with those for attention deficit, specifically the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder concerning problems in concentration, irritability, outbursts of anger, and hyperactivity in hyperarousal all overlap with the core features of attention deficit disorder and also what's known as ADD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, so ADHD. And is one way to tell whether or not there has been this reread application or my brain, stop doing that. I'm sorry. Let me start that sentence over. Is one way to tell whether or not there has been this misread application, whether the attention deficit disorder symptoms seem to minimize when stress is removed from the person's life. Yes. In the time that you spent with Erik Menendez, did he display symptoms that you would characterize as ADD? The only symptoms that I saw that I would characterize as ADD was a tendency to drift in his concentration from time to time when he would talk about specific acts of sexual molestation by his father. So that's the only time he would kind of display that ADD. And is that something that so did that make you think he had attention deficit disorder, or did you interpret it differently? I interpreted it differently. What did you ascribe that tendency to drift off to? His preoccupation with the nature of the memories of those experiences that he had with his father. Is that a symptom, that kind of drifting and preoccupation of post-traumatic stress disorder? Yes, it is. Can high levels of anxiety in a child's life produce symptoms that appear to be attention deficit disorder? Yes. Was there, apart from the trauma and the traumatic behaviors of Mr. and Mrs. Menendez, was there an atmosphere in this family, a high level of pressure that resulted in stress for Erik Menendez? Yes, there was. And what was the pressure related to? The pressure was related to a number of things for Erik Menendez. There was pressure to excel in academic studies, to achieve good grades, to get the highest marks in the school. There was pressure on Erik Menendez to be a top athlete in terms of his tennis performance, to become nationally ranked, and pressure to succeed in his tournament by being the best in beating his opponents. These are the two principal areas in which there was pressure. Ms. Abramson asks, is there anything about his abilities or the nature in which these pressures were placed on him that made him out of the ordinary? That made them out of the ordinary? Objection irrelevant. Rephrase the question. Ms. Abramson says, okay. Are all children who are involved in athletics under this kind of pressure? No. Don't all parents want their children to get good grades? Yes, most parents do. What was it about the way this family's dynamic worked that made the desire to get good grades constitute pressure that results in stress? The difference in this family was pressure was unrelenting from both of the parents, that Erik Menendez was always subjected to pressures, expectations, demands, as well as more specific kinds of things, repeated drills in tennis, repeated swimming lessons as a younger child when he was engaged in swimming, repeated demand to achieve a certain level of academic performance, for example, by getting very high grades when he was at a Princeton day school. These are the kinds of examples that illustrate that there was this constant, unrelenting expectation that was to be the best, that he was to be the best. Were the expectations realistic given his learning disabilities or athletic ability? I don't know that I can comment on the sport ability, but clearly the records I reviewed indicate the expectation in terms of the academic performance was unrealistic. With respect to sports pressure and the competition level, was there a rule in this family that winning was all that mattered? Yes. And there were no rewards for just trying. Objection leading, sustained. Was there any evidence was reward in the family for trying even if you tried your very best? Objection irrelevant, sustained. Would an environment in which a child is told they must win and receive no support for effort be one that would put extraordinary stress on a child? Yes. Now, you testified that you had, excuse me, he always has to sit on me when I'm trying to scroll through the page and I'm in the middle of a break in the page and I can't finish what I'm saying, the dog. interrupts me. Sorry. So the next question. Now you testified that you had administered certain psychological tests to Mr. Menendez. That's correct. What are those tests designed to measure? The tests are designed to measure a number of things. Some of the tests are designed to measure the symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder. One of the tests is designed to measure a broad range of psychiatric symptoms across a number of symptom clusters. And additionally, one of the tests also measures aspects of self reference, meaning how the person feels about themselves, their self esteem, their self of identity, and that sort of thing. Okay. How many different tests were there? There were 4. Would you tell us what the names of them are? Just name them for the record. Sure. There's the Trauma Symptom Inventory, the Clinician Administered Post Traumatic Stress Disorder Scale, Form 1, Current and Lifetime Diagnosis Version, the Impact of Event Scale Revised, and the Symptom Checklist 90R something something for revised. You have the originals. Do you have the originals with you? Yeah, I think so. Why don't you give them to me one at a time? Why don't we start with one, however many parts to go? Why don't you put all of the parts together? Okay, here we go. This is the symptom checklist 90. You've handed me 2 different little booklets. These are both part of the SLC 90R, the symptom checklist 90R, meaning revised. Yes. All right. And this is a test that was designed by Dr. Leonard Dargotis. Correct. And I note that I'd like to mark, Your Honor, the next number and mark these 2 parts, A and B, respectively. The court says 397A and B. Thank you, Your Honor. 397A will be what appears to be an answer sheet. Is that correct? That's correct. And was this given to you or read to Erik Menendez? It was administered by me to Erik Menendez. So, did you ask these questions verbally? Correct. And then you filled in the answers? Yes. He was given a choice of 5 different responses to each of these questions? Correct. And whichever one he gave, you marked? Correct. In the second little package here, which I will mark 397B, is what? This is the computerized scoring of the SCL 90, that scoring list. And this is the National Computer Systems Scoring System, which has the rights, the legal rights over the program, the computer program, which scores the test. And this then presents a profile, a clinical profile across the various scales that measures the different psychiatric symptoms. It also has some summary indices, scales, as well as in terms of symptom clusters. Well, we'll get to each of those in turn. Okay. So this gives us a printout and a profile of his responses to the 90 questions asked by inventory. This is scored in a way that's standardized, so it shows whether or not his responses to these different psychiatric symptom clusters are within a normal range or elevated. Is the normal marked? Well, you're looking at the second page of 397B, correct? Right. And it's entitled Interpretive Report, page 2. That's right. Is there a norm that's shown on that chart? The norm that's shown on the chart is called a T-scale, and a T-score is a standardized unit of measure in statistical and psychometrics and in math. So the T-score represents the conversion of his raw scores into a standard yardstick, which has equal intervals on the yardstick, and then knowing where the mean is, the average for a population or for people who complete this instrument, we can then determine whether or not Erik Menendez's scores are above or below or in the middle of those scores. I asked a simple question. I just want to know if the line was normal or mean. Yeah, that's what it is. Okay. So there's a line across, and that shows the mean. And then there are dots above, and that's where he scored on that test. That's right. The dots above for each of the scales indicate Erik Menendez's score on that particular psychiatric symptom cluster. Okay. What else is contained in this particular document so we're describing it? On page 3, there's the computer printout, which gives the interpretation of the scores, and that is based on how he responded to this instrument, what information it tells us diagnostically. Then there's something called pathonomic signs, and this tells us what's suggested by his response in terms of psychiatric symptoms. And finally, at the bottom of page 3, it's got a title called Symptoms of Note, and then it breaks down for the 90 items of the instrument which of them he endorsed, and in that particular way, ranging from not at all, not having a particular symptom, to extremely present. And it then indicates which were extreme and so forth, down to not at all. So basically, the series of questions, the 90 questions, are 90 different symptoms? Yes. And what are these symptoms of? These are broad psychiatric symptoms across a number of different areas of standard psychiatric symptomology, such as depression, for example. Well, does this test, is it used to measure psychiatric illness like schizophrenia? Does it go to those kids or to those kinds of disturbances as well? It can go to that kind of disturbance. The way the test is set up, it's not generated necessarily to give a single diagnosis. What it tells us is in which particular areas there's an elevation of a cluster of symptoms. And then you can profile those clusters. In other words, which is the highest, the next highest, and so on. And that in turn can be interpreted in terms of understanding the level of stress in reported psychological symptomology by the person who takes the test. Is this a test that you is this a test that you routinely use when you're investigating whether someone has the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder? Yes, I do. Has it been your experience that this test, in conjunction with other tests, can give you a consistent picture of someone with post traumatic stress disorder? Yes. I just want to mark the rest before we get into any detail. The next one is called the Impact of Events Scale Revised. A- And this is a 2-page document, asks Ms. Abramson. He says correct, which I would like to mark, Your Honor, 398A. Why don't you describe what this test is and how you administered it and what all that handwriting is all over it? Okay. This test is comprised of 22 items that measure the symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder in accordance with the DSM 4 diagnostic criteria. That's what what the revision stands for. The way the test is constructed is that it asks the person to indicate if they've had a stressful life event in the past, and then to indicate based on that event during the last week how often they have experienced or tried to avoid that particular experience. Then it groups them into the three major clusters into the DSM-4 diagnostic criteria. FYI, we're on the DSM-5, sorry. But back in 96, we were on the fourth version of it. So these items reflect traumatic intrusive imagery, thoughts about the trauma. They reflect attempts to avoid dealing with the trauma, C cluster, and also it measures symptoms of hyperarousal. The person that responds to the test reads the question and then answers the question as it pertains to the identified traumatic event, and then it indicates on a scale ranging from not at all to rarely to sometimes to often how often they have that particular reaction. Well, what is the traumatic event that you were testing Erik Menendez on for that? Sexual molestation by his father. And what are the handwritten notes that appear on that sheet? There are handwritten notes which reflect my writing when he responded to the questions I administered in two ways. I administered this in 2 ways. This was given on 12/17/95. So the past week, how did he respond to the 22 items? And then the question was repeated for Mr. Menendez in terms of August 20th, 1989, what he was feeling during those times. So I was attempting to get two measures, one now and back when he reported it. Is there a difference in how he reported experiencing these symptoms of PTSD based on the week preceding December 17th, 1995 versus, I mean, she means 80 and 89. Oh, December 17th is when he took it. Sorry. So, yeah, that's the first time he took it versus when he took it when he's thinking of August the 20th, 1989. And the answer is yes, there is a difference. Could you describe for us what those differences are? Very simply, the difference is that in his report for 1989, the symptoms were more intense. Would it make sense to you that with the passage of this much time that the symptoms would diminish somewhat? Well, first of all, would they diminish just because of the passage of time? They could, it's possible. And is there something that Erik Menendez has been doing with some frequency since at least March of 1990 concerning these traumatic events of sexual molestation that could account for the level of symptoms diminishing? Yes. What is that? Well, there are two things. One, he's incarcerated and he's outside of the abusive relationship. And number two, he's talking to Dr. Vickery as well as other professionals about his experiences. So he's gaining new perspectives on what his upbringing was like. Why would talking about these experiences, the molestation experiences, affect the symptoms? Why would it affect it? Because it gives him an opportunity to talk about things he hasn't been able to talk about his entire life. It gives him an opportunity to begin to express his feelings. It gives him the chance to speak about things that have been very difficult for him to experience and to relive and to report to anyone. So, in the process of engaging in this kind of disclosure, in the process of allowing himself to feel the feelings connected with these experiences, he can begin to look at them in a different way. He can begin to develop a different perspective. He can begin to place them into some kind of meaningful way for him in terms of the effects of those experiences on his psyche and his mental state. And perhaps it gives him a chance to look back and maybe put his whole life in a little bit different perspective by having those two things. Has it been found as one of the core beliefs of psychotherapy that if people do this, talk about the difficult experiences, it helps them get over it? Yes. And part of them getting over it is to have the symptoms diminish, correct? That's correct. What is the third test? The third test is the clinician administered post traumatic stress disorder scale, or CAPS for short. Ms. Abramson says, I want to mark this booklet or package of documents that contain that. What does that go to? It goes with this. So we've got to put it together. Excuse me for this side conversation. 398A has two parts. Correct. The first part we've talked about that has the handwritten notes and the answer sheet we'll call 398A, and the second part does what? These two parts, or these two sheets that look like charts. His answer, the two sheets that are charts are scoring of the impact of events in scale, and it's scored twice, once for 1989 and once for 1995. And that was my dog again. The two sheets, he likes to highlight things that are not important. The two sheets that are charts are scoring of the impact of events and scale, and it's scored twice, once for 89 and once for 95. And this gives a summary of his scores on each of the subscales of the impact of event scale, and it then generates a numerical number indicating the level of severity of the symptom clusters for the event areas of PTSD as defined by the DSM-4. Ms. Abramson asks, and each cluster, for the purpose of this test, the clusters that are included are avoidance as a cluster? Correct. That's the cluster C. Or the C cluster. Intrusion? That's B cluster. And hyperarousal? That's the D, David cluster. So I'll mark these two scoring answer sheets rather as 398B. Now, the third test you were describing is the CAPS, Clinician Administered PTS Scale? Yes. And this is just one booklet now, or is there another piece to it? No, it's one booklet. Ms. Abramson says, we'll mark it with the court's permission, $3.99. And and I will ask you, what is the test? How does it work? The clinician administered post-traumatic stress disorder scale is an instrument that was developed by the National Center for PTSD and its protocol. By that, I mean it's a structured protocol by which the clinician asks a series of questions to a person and in a particular order. And the questions deal with the symptomology of post traumatic stress disorder, and it looks at both the frequency and intensity of the reported symptom, assuming it's reported by the patient. It also allows it to be done at two different time intervals, whether they currently are reporting that symptom or whether or not in the past, at some time in their lifetime, they've reported that symptom. That's called a lifetime indication. So essentially, what it does is it goes through through the diagnostic criteria for post traumatic stress disorder with a series of structured questions asked by the clinician to the patient or the client or the participant, and then generates a score for both the frequency and intensity for every symptom of post traumatic stress disorder. Now, in addition to that, there's some other features of this questionnaire, and that is it asks some associated features of post traumatic stress disorder. These, what? Asked Ms. Amerson. Associated features, says the witness. Well, what's an associated feature? Asked Amerson. The witness says these are features of the broader symptom of post traumatic stress disorder that are beyond what's simply listed in the diagnostic manual. It includes things such as if a person is guilty about an act of omission or commission, guilty about being the survivor of a traumatic event, whether they report homicidal tendencies, whether they have disillusionment with authority figures. What's homicidal? A wish to kill. There's other things like hopelessness and sadness and depression and feelings of being overwhelmed and so forth. Finally, what it allows the clinician or rater to do is to make a summary, which is on the last page of the booklet, the last 2 pages of the intensity and frequency of the patient's reported symptoms, current and lifetime, across each of the areas of post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as to indicate whether they have these associated features that the literature tells us are associated with post-traumatic stress. So it concludes by giving us a diagnosis of whether or not the person who takes this test or responds to the protocol meets the diagnostic criteria for post traumatic stress disorder. Ms. Aberson asks, well, what is the last test? The last test is the Trauma Symptom Inventory. There are several parts to this. The first part that I'm holding here is the summary profile. I want to mark Ms. Aberson says, I want to mark each of these parts, well, use 400, as 400A is the profile form. That's where the results are put, basically. That's right, says the witness. Well, why don't you tell me what this is? This is the answer sheet, and this was Erik Menendez's answers to the 100 questions on the Trauma Symptom Inventory. I'd like to mark this 400B. The next part? The next part is the scoring sheet. This is a procedure for scoring the various subscales that make up the Trauma Symptom Inventory. Ms. Amerson says, now when someone completes this test and you've done the scoring, do you get a graph that results, which through interpretation can tell you whether or not someone has PTSD? Yes. And was such a graph generated when you took the scoring and put it onto this first sheet, 400A? Yes, it was. Now, do you also, for comparative purposes, graph out onto the same sheet that has Erik Menendez's profile, additional profiles? Yes, I did. What else is on there? What I graphed out on the profile was the PTSD profile as indicated in the scoring manual. So that's the standard PTSD profile or a graph that shows PTSD? Yes. Developed by, well, who developed this particular test, by the way? Dr. John Briere here in Los Angeles. And were you aware that Dr. Briere testified in the first trial? I'm probably not saying that right. Yes. Did you read his testimony? Yes. Now, was it your understanding in reading his testimony that Dr. Briere was testifying to matters in general principles? Yes. And that he had never met nor had ever interviewed either Erik nor Lyle Menendez? Correct. And is Dr. Briere a nationally recognized expert in PTSD, particularly with respect to people who were molested as children? Yes. Okay, now you were saying that, so you put the standard PTSD profile on the chart? Correct. And anything else? Well, once you put it on the chart, it gives you a graph that indicates across areas that reflect traumatic stress and post traumatic stress symptoms where the profiles are most highly elevated. In other words, where the person taking the test or the patient reports the highest levels of these particular kinds of symptoms. And in using the profile, that is, using the elevations on the different points across the profile, then those can be grouped together to render an interpretation about the severity and the condition of trauma related symptoms for the person taking the test. Ms. Abramson says, now, did we compare a blow up of that? Yes. Your Honor, I'd like to mark it hasn't been graphed in yet, right? That's correct. This is the witness. Ms. Abramson says, we would like to mark this 401. The court says 401. Ms. Abramson says, was it your intention, Dr. Wilson, to show the jury on this what the results were on the tests administered to Erik Menendez and to also show how it compares to a standard PTSD profile? Yes. And depending on where you place the dots, there are columns here, correct? Correct. Okay, why don't you step down, Dr. Wilson, and explain what the columns are and what the numbers are? Basically, explain that chart, and then we can deal with filling it in. Do you have a pointer? Asked the witness. Right here, there's two of them. Okay, this is a profile form for charting the results of the test of the Trauma Symptom Inventory, or TSI, is what it says up there. And in the bottom part, here we enter the raw score for each of the various subscales on the test instrument, which are then converted into standardized scores, which are referred to as T-scores or standard scores. And then using the raw number of the T-score, we then plot them on this axis here, which tells them where their profile is. Each one of these scales is measuring a different aspect of traumatic symptoms. The first three scales measure what are known as validity scales, that is, attitude about the test taker, what's in their mind, or how are they approaching taking the test. Okay. There are letters underneath each of the columns, and I assume they mean something. Yes. Are those abbreviations for something? Yes. Could you tell us what the abbreviation is and what it means? Sure. You said the first three, or the so called validity scale, is the attitude of the person taking the test? Yes. It's not measuring symptoms or anything like that. It looks at how they approach taking the test. Why is that important? We want to know whether or not the person is responding in a standard way or an unusual way. You want to know if the person is responding to all the answers in the same way or whether they're responding inconsistently. These are indices of validity, and they also help us to know whether or not the person is truthfully reporting as they take the test. The person could take this test and be joking and give all kinds of screwy answers, and you'd be able to know that the answers don't make sense. For example, the response levels look at whether or not the person has a tendency just to answering everything with a zero and say, I don't have any of that stuff. And that could be a very defensive way of taking the test rather than disclosing when they may, in fact, have symptoms that they might have just a general tendency to go write down all the items and circle zeros, or they be inconsistent, or they'll be inconsistent, whether or not if you ask the same questions in different parts, they give different answers. So, if there's a high degree of inconsistency, it may well suggest the person is either not comprehending the items, they're faking, they're responding in a random manner, but they're not going through the questionnaire in a way that would tell us that it's a valid answer. What is the first one? This is atypical responding. There are certain items developed in this questionnaire that look to see if a person has endorsed these. If there's a high level of these atypical responses, then when you get the profile, you have to determine whether or not the person who took the test understood what they were doing. If it's extremely highly elevated, it may suggest that they're responding to items that suggest a very serious mental disorder or psychosis, or it may be that they're endorsing certain items that are trauma specific. And so it helps us also to inquire about those as well. What are the next columns? Okay, these are measures of post traumatic stress symptom clusters as well as associated features of the syndrome. First one is anxious arousal. And so this is picking up hyperarousal, anxiety, states of tension, primarily anxiety related phenomenon. Is there a time for this for is there a time for which this test is supposed to capture symptoms at a particular time historically? Is this supposed to be the time when the test was taken or sometime in the past? This is measuring symptoms at the time the test was taken. So this isn't like the other one that talks about either lifetime experiencing of symptoms or experiencing them in 89 as compared to now. Uh-huh. This is the here and now. This is the here and now. Okay. Okay. The next one indicated with D is depression, and that's measuring the symptom associated with depressive symptomology, feeling blue, down in the dumps, low in energy, worthless, wanting to take your own life, those kinds of symptom clusters. The next abbreviation is AI, anger and irritability. That's not AI like artificial intelligence, anger and irritability. That's picking up trauma related symptoms where there's anger, outbursts of anger, irritability, being keyed up, on edge, and symptoms of that sort. Well, when people can be angry and irritable, and it can have nothing to do with trauma. That's correct. They can be depressed and have nothing to do with trauma. That's correct. Is there something in the nature of these questions and the way they're asking that make it clear you're asking about things affiliated with specific events? There's some of the questions that are more keyed towards specific traumatic kinds of experiences and others that are not. That's one of the useful things about the test because it allows us to look at the person's profile and then compare it to the people who have known past post traumatic stress disorders, known histories of sexual abuse, and so forth. Okay. The next cluster is intrusive experiences, says the witness, and this refers specifically to intrusive recollections of traumatic events. That's the B cluster for post traumatic stress, right? The next one is defensive avoidance. That is also measuring the avoidance and numbing symptoms in the DSM 4. That's the C cluster, as we've been referring to it. The next one, abbreviated, is DIS, which stands for disassociation. This is measuring the symptoms of disassociation or dissociative phenomenon. Alterations in consciousness, alterations in awareness about behavior, a depersonalization, various forms of dissociative reactions in the whole cluster of dissociative symptomology as it relates to trauma specific events. The next one, SC, refers to sexual concerns. That's straightforward, and that's the extent to which that person is reporting symptoms around a concern with sexual behavior. Saberson asks, is it likely that you don't get too much responsiveness on that when the subject of the exam is in jail or in the environment where they don't have a sexual life? Correct. Go ahead. The next scale is called dysfunctional sexual behavior, and dysfunctional sexual behavior specifically refers to sexual behaviors that are dysfunctional and potentially self destructive, such as prostitution or promiscuity, unprotected sexuality, and so forth. This is purposely put in the scale because it's tapping it's tapping phenomenon of dysfunctional sexual behavior that often shows up in patients who have a history of sexual child abuse, particularly girls. Yes, the next scale abbreviation is IRS, stands for impaired self-reference. And impaired self-reference refers to impairments in how the person feels about themselves. And specifically, this is addressing concerns about the person's sense of self-esteem their sense of identity, whether their identity feels intact or pulls apart. It's feelings of self worth or worthlessness. That's specifically what's referred to as impaired self reference. So, impairment means that the person is reporting on the test, they're endorsing items that suggest that they have a negative self image, poor self confidence, or identity confusion. You point out that when we went through the symptom clusters B, C, and D for post-traumatic stress disorders, that self-reference or impaired self-reference was not specifically considered a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. That's correct. And we talked about, however, that it was impaired self-reference, a part of what's known as battered persons syndrome. Correct. Why then on PTSD, on a PTSD test, is it impaired self reference there? It's on this particular test because the literature that has accumulated, particularly in the last 10 years, so this is 1996, so we're talking back from 86 and on, indicates that in populations, especially with a history of childhood trauma and childhood traumatic events such as sexual abuse, that impaired self reference is one of the most common consequences. It addresses the inner core of the person's feelings about themselves. So, in this particular test, it's important to look at this, particularly as an area of attention for treatment considerations to see how the person is feeling about themselves. What's their self worth? If they've been abused, guarantee they have low self esteem because that's what their abuser does to them. Purposely makes them feel like they can never be good enough. And that's on purpose. They want you to always be improving, be better. I don't know. So, even if it isn't the DSM 4, that doesn't mean that the research wouldn't support looking at this area as a potential area of symptoms for post traumatic stress disorder. That's correct. Because these definitions, do the definitions in the DSM change? Yes, over the years. Uh huh. As more research is done, additional things are put in as symptoms or things to look at? Yes, that's correct. Okay, but we're on DSM 4. This is 96. It hasn't, I mean, it's been a long time since they've revised it and made a DSM 6. We're on 4. So, or right now, currently in the year of 2006, we're on the DSM 5. But back here in 1996, we're still on the prior version. So it hasn't changed much unless there are multiple versions, but they don't renumber them. I don't know. Anyways, so he says that yes, that's correct. You would do more research and update the book. He continues to say, and finally, the last subscale is called TRB, which is tension reducing behavior. Tension reducing behavior. This is the tendency to engage in behavior that releases tension. That releases tension. I just lost my spot. Sorry. That releases tension. Excessive drinking or other activities that are an attempt to bring down the experience of tension. So taking, recreational drugs or abusing drugs or whatever. Alcohol, pot, crack, whatever, whatever your choice is to minimize that stress or tension that you're feeling. So these are negative or bad behaviors that tend to bring about, yes, they tend to be self destructive of impairing behaviors. Well, why aren't they good behaviors which bring it down? There are good behaviors that bring it down, but this instrument is designed to measure trauma related symptomology. So if someone is functionally very ill, they wouldn't score high on these scales. They would score high within a normal range. I was going to finish. The other piece of this is the literature tells us people who have post traumatic stress disorder frequently engage in tension reduction behaviors, such as self medication with drugs and alcohol. Because they can't just relax themselves out of it? Correct. Okay, now on the small form you have charted where Erik Menendez's responses were and also the PTSD profile. First of all, did you draw a conclusion from the profiles that the profile that you obtained of him from the test as to how he compares to the known PTSD profile? Yes, I did. And what was that conclusion? The conclusion is that he scores very high on the scales that measure post traumatic stress disorder. In fact, higher on most of the scales than the normative people or profile, sorry, the normative profile for post traumatic stress disorder. Why would he be, if you have an opinion, why would he be higher? We're talking about normal post traumatic stress disorder. Well, it's not normal, but what we're talking about in this chart is this red line is the normal that has been identified by Dr. Briere and others in the research that when they take this instrument, this is what their score looks like. I've indicated with the red line here. In answer to your question, in scoring Erik Menendez, we see that on many of the areas. We're going to see it when you put it on the big one. He's higher on the specific measure of the post-traumatic stress in many places than the normative profile. He's lower in some other areas. The normative profile is supposed to be like a threshold. If you're there, you can start talking about PTSD, but it can be higher than that. Yes. So it's the threshold for finding it. Yes. It represents how people with PTSD show up. That's one way to think about it. Did you want to do this? Sure. Here's the blue pen to show Erik Menendez's profile, and then you can use the red one to show the normative. Okay, those are the dots. Are you going to be able to connect them? Yeah, we can connect them. You want to use a straight line or a straight edge of some kind? Yeah, if we have one. So he's obviously marking up a chart. Well, we have this. This is the back of the prosecution exhibit. Maybe we can use this. That's how's that? Okay, if I can assist you, or sorry, he says, if I can get an assistant. Is Mr. Levin available? Mr. Levin, are you available to assist? Mr. Levin says yes. He's connecting the dots, says Miss Abramson. The witness says, okay, that's the profile. Mr. Levin says one more. Miss Abramson says, now that blue line is Erik Menendez's profile. Now you look at how high up the scale and how down the scale his response is placed, right? Right. Why don't we start first with what you call the validity scale? We have the atypical response, the response level, and inconsistency. The court says, you have to move so the jurors can see. The witness says, I'm standing on the other side. Now my back is to you. The court says, it's okay. The witness says, we have these three validity scales, atypical response level and inconsistency. We had a raw scale of 7 on atypical, which gave him a T score of about 74. What does that mean? He endorsed a couple of items that were in this measure that were indicative of unusual responses, and one of them had to do with hearing voices, and the other had to do with taste. Those were the two items in the booklet. Did you draw any conclusions about those two responses? I think you had said earlier those atypical responses are actually connected to traumatic events. Yes, I concluded two things. One, based on the instruction manual, his scores within the normal range. Up here in the instruction manual, when the score is above the line, it's indicative there may be something wrong with the test taker's approach to answering the questions. I did inquire about the items that he endorsed that gave him that score, and the voice he referred to is his father. So he hears his father's voice in his head. And the unusual taste had to do with the fact he said since he's been in prison, he doesn't have a lot of taste for food. Now, the response level here is down at 0. He was not responding in a random manner. He was answering the questions directly, and he had one score on inconsistency, which was only one slight deviation. So this is well within the accepted range of validity that Erik Menendez, in taking his test, took it in a valid manner. Is this a line here that establishes the validity range? In other words, the black line here is everything below that valid and everything above that maybe you should take another look at? Yes, says the witness. Okay. Now we move to the clinical scales from here. Go right ahead. Dr. Wilson says what the manual suggests is you chart the highest profiles, which scales have the highest profile. In Mr. Menendez's case, I'm going to indicate the highest scales were with intrusive experiences with a T-score of 89, followed by anxious arousal, a T-score of 79, followed by depression, a T-score of 78, followed by dissociation with a score of 70, followed by impaired self-reference at 67. And according to the scoring manual, the combination of elevations, high intrusive experiences, anxious arousal, depression, dissociation, and impaired self-reference is the classical representation for post-traumatic stress disorder. Ms. Amerson asks, now where are the low points? I see there's 3 low points. Yeah, the low points are in anger and irritability. He's not angry or irritable right now. Is that what that means? Yes, at the time of the taking of this test. Okay. Dysfunctional sexual behavior and attention reduction behavior. And you're aware that he is on medication to deal with anxiety and depression at this time? Correct. Even on medications, he's showing a high depression scale. Yes. Would you assume if he were not on medication for depression, it would be even higher? Yes. Can you show us now to compare what his profile looks like with the threshold PTSD profile? Yes. Now, his chart looks more like a roller coaster than that one. Does that mean anything? Yeah, it means he has more elevations on specific scales that deal with classic post-traumatic stress symptomology. That is, intrusive, reliving, anxious arousal, the depression and disassociation, and impaired self-reference. Would you have expected, based on your analysis of him and the nature of the traumas and the reports going back so long as of symptoms, would you have expected him to show symptom severity such as reflected in this chart? Yes. That is what it's showing, that his symptoms are severe? Yes, they're severe. Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, this would be a good place to take a break. The court says, okay, we'll recess until Monday at 8:30. Again, don't discuss the case with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about testimony. We'll resume on Monday at 8:30. And that is where I leave you. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate you all. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this case. See you guys in the next one. Take care. That's the end of this Trial Transcripts Exposed. Thanks for following along with me. Like if you want more, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below. See you next time.